think the reason people weighed in immediately on this, it seems to be this rising severity and boldness of criminals in this country. And I think police so often are overwhelmed, but then we sort of have a catch and release bail system in this country where bad guys are out committing crimes while they're on bail for other crimes. And it feels as though people are left to take matters into their own hands. We talked before we started recording, and I think you touched on it a little bit, of the case of Ian Thompson. But he's not alone in, people who are confronted with home invaders who then have to act in defense of their own lives, be it by firing warning shots, or in the case of at least two recent cases here in Alberta, Eddie Maurice and then an unnamed homeowner in Red Deer. Eddie Maurice fired a shot. He was a farmer in southern Alberta. He winged the home invader, and then he was sued by the home invader after he was charged. Luckily, we changed the laws here in Alberta to prevent those sorts of lawsuits from going forward. And then a Red Deer homeowner beaten with a baseball bat in his own home in the middle of the night. He was miraculously able to get to a firearm. He was not charged. He killed his home invader. But Ian Thompson wasn't quite so lucky, was he?
He did get charged, and initially they charged him for the people who don't sort of know his background, some criminals attacked his home and they were firebombing it. He was a firearm instructor and managed to get into his safe, loaded a gun, and exited the house and fired warning shots into the air. They initially charged him with discharging the firearm and, various other things. And then eventually they just boiled it down to charging him with careless storage, because their theory was that if he could get to the gun before he burned to death, that meant that he couldn't possibly have had the gun legitimately stored, which is kind of a crazy thing. You being alive here is proof of the offense. It's
right.
Now, that was also a case that was marked in part by some very startling misapprehensions of fact by because there's a moment that happened in court where they thought he was picking up his brass to show that he had, a consciousness of guilt, because otherwise, why would you pick up the brass from outside? When it was actually revealed that what he was using was a revolver, which doesn't eject the brass, which the people charging in these circumstances don't necessarily have a very thorough knowledge of firearms, and that can lead them to make some serious assumptions. Ultimately, he was cleared. We have Peter Cahill, who was convicted of manslaughter with respect to confronting somebody who was stealing his vehicle. And this also indicates the dangers, right? You don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to defend because the law allows for reasonable force, but they will never find reasonable force in defense of property. Now, it might be in defense of life. So that's the other thing. But the law in Cahill essentially changed such that the jury was able to say that the defensive strategy he should have taken was just never to go out there in the first place. Just let them steal your truck, which is not a satisfying option for a lot of people. And we have a case just reported. I'm just seeing it was reported June 18th. So yesterday is when this story dropped. There was a guy in Barhead who went to check on his neighbor's property, and he was armed with a phone. That's what he had. But the people who were there breaking into the property, they took a shot at him with a rifle, which thankfully seems to have missed. They ran him over with their pickup truck. They struck his pickup truck. And that was because they weren't okay with being confronted with, somebody who's taking video evidence. His leg was broken in 5 places. And I can tell you, if I'm out in one of these rural properties, you know that when you call the police are probably half an hour away.
For sure.
It's, sometimes the police are not close, especially if and it gets even worse the more remote you are. And, if you go out there and confront people, it might be that your body is found a long time later. I
Yeah.
probably would not have felt comfortable if my neighbor out in a rural property like that said, I think my place is being broken into. I'd bring the camera, but I'd also want something not to defend the property, but to defend myself, right? If
Right.
somebody's going to start taking shots at me with a rifle, I don't want to, I want my options to be more than just die. And I mean, this guy's, in the hospital, he's, all of these things, and he wasn't charged because he didn't have a firearm. But I go, is this the society we want? Numbers wise, things don't seem to be picking up that much. But the problem is that the numbers, as reported, seem to be concealing sort of an increase in severity in things. We see more people who are willing to kick down doors or try to kick down doors while the homeowners are home, for example. And that's an inherently dangerous situation, because at that point, you're in a confrontation, you're in a dangerous situation, and those can go quite badly. Even simply, there was a case that was reported, and this was a US case, but a lot of the commentary online was people saying this guy managed to get a gun and shot them rather than letting himself be tied up. And there were people saying, well, why not let yourself be tied up? They'll tie you up, they'll take your stuff, and they'll go. Well, if they tie you up, then they can kill you fairly easily.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, just being tied up itself can be fatal. Lots of people have died
Sure.
from being tied up because, they put a rope around your chest and it restricts your breathing, and positional asphyxia can be a cause of death. All of these are very concerning, and people are all the more concerned because they feel that the justice system may not have their backs, and in fact may be sort of even-handed in a situation where even-handed is not called for, or in fact lean more on them, because you get situations where, like, the criminals have fled and the police don't know who they are, but it's really easy to pick out the guy whose home it was, because he's the person who called, he's right there, he's an easy charge. I mean, in terms of the bail system, I am a big believer in bail. We
Sure.
need a
Me
bail
too.
system
Yep.
because, the police can charge people wrongly. I've seen so many cases of wrongful, and all of these people who are defending themselves who get charged, they need bail too. The
Absolutely.
problem is our system has gotten really bad at identifying the difference between somebody who's dangerous and somebody who just makes us mad. And sometimes we'll deny bail for people who make us angry
Hmm.
and approve bail for people who are potentially a dangerous threat. So I don't know if we can fix this through legislation, but maybe, education of judges or something like that, some sort of, risk assessment instrument. Because if somebody's committing, very simple property crime that avoids people, they might be a lower threat. But if they're committing crimes that involve confronting people or potentially confronting people, or if they're committing offenses or, and we have to weigh the evidence, because at the bail stage, nobody's been convicted. They're presumed
Right.
innocent. That's why we have bail. But you can weigh some of the considerations, like, is this person carrying a weapon? Does this person have a past history in terms of, if sure, it might be just a burglary into a shed, but if this guy has 3 priors where he's been stopped and he's beaten somebody, then maybe this is a situation to deny bail. But, the person who's acting in self-defense, maybe we should be more liberal on bail, and particularly, maybe we should be also considering whether we have to charge somebody right away. Lots of these cases, the statute of limitations is either forever because it's, certain offenses, or effectively forever based on technicalities in the law that the government is able to sort of manipulate to extend the statute of limitations to perpetual. In these cases, you go, well, they have all the time in the world. So somebody like your Ian Thompson, you don't have to lay charges right away. You can say, let's investigate this. Let's determine who the bad guy is here. And if there's a case where you've got somebody like a homeowner who might have technically violated the law, but is still clearly the good guy, in the Western nomenclature, if you've got your black hat and your white hat, this guy might have, you might have somebody who, for instance, didn't store their firearm properly, a fairly minor offense in the scheme of things, but prevented himself from getting murdered. And you go, well, we've got a pretty clear black hat, white hat situation. Maybe we can just let the guy who didn't have his firearm stored properly off with a lecture instead of trying to proceed with charges. Especially because we should recognize that the impact of charges can be disproportionate. If you're a gangster who's got a lengthy criminal history, you may not care if you get charges. But if you're a homeowner and you get, if you get charged with something and held without bail for a month, a lot of your life will have fallen apart by the end of that month. You're going to have been fired from your job. You're going to have missed bills. You're going to, have missed rent, all of these things. And so we end up with an uneven playing field in that the consequences are so much more severe for the people who try to follow the law generally. And this is, it ends up with a system that I think is very well intentioned. And I don't think anybody in the system is trying to make it not work. But it also doesn't feel like it's working for a lot of people.